director of the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies at ACC. I'm also a psychology professor here. Please, Leila will put a link to our events page on our website. Leila is the coordinator for the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, and she does 99.9999% of the work that goes into bringing all of this together. And she will say a little bit about the logistics today. You want to talk about recording?
Yeah, I don't think there's too much to say besides we are recording this. We do post these to our YouTube channel. The center has a YouTube channel, but we also post them on the website, the department or the center's website. And I did drop a link to our events page, so you can check out what we have coming up. And there are links there that will direct you to the pages where we'll post the recordings directly.
I want to also introduce our curator for the film series, The Cinema of Conflict and Transformation, my colleague, Dr. Mark Cunningham.
So hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm Dr. Mark Cunningham. I'm professor of radio, television, and film in the radio, television, and film department here at ACC. I teach courses in media literacy, intro to cinema, and I also teach courses in the introduction to the survey course, the media course that we teach, introduction to radio, television, and film. So, you know, I've written a lot about film. I'm and published a lot on film from subjects as varied as Spike Lee to the authorship, if you will, in the Twilight films. I'm currently, I've been saying writing a book, but I'm finishing a book. My deadline is actually Halloween, Sunday. So sometime next week, I'm getting ready to kind of turn my book in. It's on race, gender, and narrative in John Singleton's Hood trilogy. This movie centered around South Central Los Angeles, Boys in the Hood, Poetic Justice, and Baby Boy. So I'm happy to getting that published through Columbia University Press's film imprint, Wallflower. So, so not too bad, not too bad. It took the age 51 to be able to do that, but hey. Anyway, all right, so I'm happy to have my two discussants here today to help us kind of talk about the great Raoul Peck's Exterminate the Brutes. We have, so I have to say this first, Mr. Patrick Patterson, when I taught public school, my students know this, that I taught public school for 18 years. A number of those years I taught high school and I taught at LBJ. And Pops was my, I call him Pops because the kids thought he was my dad, and so we went along with it. And so it's been like that ever since. So Pops was my former principal, and now Pops works at UT. And then we also have Dr. Megan McGregor as well too. So I'll let the two of them. Megan and I came in together at the same time. We were in our training together. So I have a connection to both of our discussions today. So we'll let you hear from them about their background. So
go ahead, Megan.
Okay. Well, I'm really happy to be here. I am Dr. Megan McGregor. It is Megan, but that's okay. You can call me.
Sorry.
It's fine. It's fine. I have a PhD from University of Oklahoma in modern American history, and my area of specialty is American nationalism. So you know, I'm kind of right in the wheelhouse here for what Raoul Peck was doing, even though I do a little bit, maybe a little bit earlier. But I've been teaching since 2012. I started at Houston Community College, and then I made the move to Austin in 2019. So I am really, really happy to be here. One of the other things too that I think is kind of helping me figure out some of Raoul Peck's ideas is that one of my secondary fields is Native American history. And so I've done a lot of work in presenting conference papers and a lot of research in more modern American history, especially Native American history, especially boarding schools and not closing till 1980. I also worked for a tribe, a nation, the Caddo Nation. So I have a little bit of a background there that hopefully will help us a little bit to unpack some of this stuff. So I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much.
Hi, Patrick Patterson. Currently, I'm Assistant Vice President of School Partnerships at UT Austin. I also serve on the board of Communities and Schools Central Texas. So I'm telling you that because my comments have nothing to do with the organizations that I work with. My comments will be based on my self-study over the last 63 years as a Black man in this country, and also my experience in the school settings. I started my teaching career in Chicago. I taught at the high school level for a couple of years. I taught algebra and I coached baseball and basketball. I moved to Austin in 1983, where I taught 4th grade, 6th grade, and physical education at that time at Blackshear Elementary School. I also became the first Black male professional in the history of Summit Elementary School in Northwest Austin. I went there from Blackshear as an assistant principal in 1990 to 91. And then I became a principal at Riley Elementary School, right down the street from ACC on Denson. I became a principal at Dobie Middle School 4 years after that. And then 3 years after that, I became the principal of Lanier High School, which is now named Navarro High School. And I did that for 5 years. And then I went to LBJ High School. And at the time that I became principal, the magnet LASA was a academic program at LBJ, and we split off during my tenure, in the middle of my tenure, so that they became separate schools. And then I retired from the school district at age 12, 2010, and I've been at UT for 11 years now. I started as an executive director of school partnerships and was promoted to assistant VP in January 1st, 2014. So my notoriety in Austin, Texas, if I could call it that, is I'm the only person in the history of Austin schools to have been a principal at every level. So that helped me get the current job that I have, because I have a very unique perspective. And I actually followed some families, or some families followed me from second graders on through high school graduation. So I had a very unique career, very fulfilling. And I'm old, so I will say what I want to say to y'all, okay? Glad to be here.
My students that are with us, does this dude sound like anybody y'all know? All right.
I told you he's my son. He's my block.
So let's go ahead and get the conversation started. So just to give a little background, so as everyone I'm sure knows from all the material that's been sent out from the center, everything about this film. This film is a documentary that's told in 4 parts. We're only going to be discussing the first 2, based on I call him the great Raoul Peck, because he's a immigrant from Haiti, and he is probably most known at this point for the documentary that he did about James Baldwin a few years ago called "I Am Not Your Negro," which is equally brilliant, I think. And it had the distinction when it came out, when it was nominated for the Oscars. It was nominated along with The 13th, and which is also another a brilliant film. But also too, it was nominated with Ezra Edelman's O.J. Made in America, which is, I think, a masterpiece actually. So it was very difficult to choose between those. But anyway, so Peck has made what I think to be another masterful film in this one called Exterminate All the Brutes, which comes from, really has its basis in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which is, one of the perennial colonialist texts, right? And how we kind of talk about colonialism. So I'd like to jump off with the conversation in the way that this movie, this documentary really kind of talks about, not only indigenous people, but, Black people, Hispanic people, and how, these, white supremacy and things of that nature have really kind of affected all of these different groups. And then but more importantly, not only that, how are we reading history? you know, I think it becomes really interesting in the ways in which, I mean, we've so many times heard the expression that history is written by the winners, right? And so this way that we've gotten so much of history being written by the winners, but now these moments are coming out where we're getting history, the real story, if you will. So I'd like to start with the question, really just starting from something that comes up in the first episode of the documentary, and it opens with these three words that are said to have marked, or that Peck says has marked the history of humanity, and they are civilization, colonization, and extermination. So if, you know, our discussants could please speak to how these three words really, you feel, have tainted American culture and world culture at that.
As far as I'm concerned, those three terms have been developed by the people who have won the wars, and the people who have won the wars and taken over the world were the people who utilized weapons of mass destruction first. So the title of the film, Exterminate the Brutes, even the term brute has been defined, because if you look at the first term, civilization, I mean, who is determining what is civil and what is not? And how can a people who basically make whole peoples disappear on purpose, intentionally, be civilized or define what civilization is? So that's how that word is tainted. A people who have acted as brutes has defined the word civilizations. Colonization, that in and of itself is a derogatory term, because it explicitly means that you go into a people's settled area and you take over and exterminate them. And again, we're talking about brutish behavior brought about by the people who believe they are closest to God in image and in likeness. And then, excuse my dog in the back, he's his big baby. And then extermination. What type of human, what type of civilized individual would even think about exterminate a whole tribe of people? Well, that's what we have. And those are the folks who have written our history.
Yeah, I actually wrote down some of the same things. And, you know, I think, you know, you have to talk about the idea of who gets to decide what is civilized, right? And from a perspective of studying Native culture, so I teach both halves of US history, and I always make sure that in the early American history, we start the first week by talking about ancient cultures and civilizations. And I do use that term very specifically because, you know, we tend to think when the Europeans arrived, even the term New World, which Raoul Peck also uses, has that connotation that the Americas were empty, that they were devoid of culture. But then you look at Native cultures, whether you're talking about the Mississippian culture, which is far more advanced than we tended to think, or the Mexica, or the Aztec, or the Maya, incredibly advanced cultures, brilliant mathematicians, right? You know, some of their buildings, like at Chichen Itza, just defy, I mean, at least my historical mind, right? And, you know, the Aztecs had sewage systems, they had apartment buildings, they had neighborhood schools, but yet the Europeans arrive and they're the ones that decide these people look different, they're not Christian, and so we are going to decide that they are not civilized. You know, Tenochtitlan was larger than almost every other European city except maybe Paris, right? And they didn't have like modern sewer systems, right? Or potable water. But yet it's the Europeans that arrive that decide these are people that are unchristian, they're not Christian, so therefore they are uncivilized, and therefore they are brutes. So they look at them as less than human, as animals. And so then you're right, it allows those civilized people to then colonize and then exterminate. Yeah.
Wow. You know, immediately, anytime I was watching the documentary, and immediately just brings to mind reading Shakespeare's The Tempest, and I think about, this man and his daughter are shipwrecked on this island, and Caliban is already there. And Caliban, of course, is brown, darker skinned, right? And immediately, we have got to fix him. We've got to civilize. We've got to teach him how to act, right? Whatever. And it's like you're basically an interloper on his land, right? Someplace he's already established, residence, so to speak, and that he has to be changed. And it's always like the history of that, right? And I think Peck, makes that very clear in the film, that there's been so much of these, these three words, and in that order sometimes, right, happening. First, we're going to fix you, then we're going to get you in line, and then we're going to get rid of you if we don't need you or if we want your land. Right. And then
even the term, Mark, even the term exterminate.
Yes.
Not only did they exterminate a people, they exterminated the notion that these folks were intelligent. I mean, even today you have people who actually believe the pyramids were built by extraterrestrials. It's no way Black or brown people could have the intelligence to put that together. So it's exterminating even the knowledge base.
If you don't mind, there was something else that also brought to my mind as a scholar of Native American history, and that is the idea that there were tribes in the Southeast that were civilized, right? The Cherokee and the Choctaw. And so I asked my students, why are they considered civilized? Why did white people consider them civilized? Well, they had a written language. They became Christians. Some of them owned slaves, right? And so they look at them as civilized, but yet they still treat them with brutality, because they might be civilized, but they're still not quite as civilized as us, right? As the white Americans. So I think that was also an interesting idea that I wanted to bring up, that some of them are considered, I don't know, it's a term I don't like to use, obviously, because we try to get away from that, but yet that's what they consider them to be. So why is that? But yet, why did they still kick them off of their land and force them onto the Trail of Tears,
Yeah, I mean, that happens, which I think is a nice segue into the next question. And this, may seem obvious, but I think it's a good conversation for us to have in this collective, right? And that, why do you all think that those of us who have been coded as other, and there's so many of us, right, that have been coded as other, and interestingly enough, that most of us who have been coded as other are some shade of brown or some darker shade, or not what have you. Why is it this otherness, right, or what we're coding as other, is what I say, poses such a threat? Not only historically, but currently, even right now, there is this threat, from otherness.
Yes, currently, look, color and ethnicity, that's all a political construct. It's only happened since this country began. So for me, the term other is another attempt, or a very good attempt, at diluting the power base of the political structure of a particular country. And a good example of what I'm trying to convey is the fact that last year there were 46 million Blacks in America. There were 51 million, 51, let me get this right. Yes, 51 million Hispanics in the country. However, there were 18 million coded other. There, for the longest time, African Americans were the second most population in this country, and it helped wield a political stronghold to make moves in this country in terms of racial progress. Then recently, I would say in the last 30 years, I'm saying recently, that's half my life, we started doing censuses with Hispanic or Black of Hispanic origin, white of Hispanic origin, white, Black, other. And here's the thing. See, coming out of this Black man's mouth, folks, I am not a white supremacist, okay? And I believe most people in this country are to a degree. And so when you talk about other and you're diluting the political construct of people, not only does it affect the white supremacists who are racially white supremacists, it affects so-called Black people. Because when you're living in a society such as the one we've grown up in, some Black people don't want to be Black. They want to get as far as Black as possible. They say things like, oh, I'm part Puerto Rican, or I'm part Haitian, or I got some white in me along the way. And they'll code that other. And that takes away political power and demographics, and it has. And so for me, this country has always had creative ways to attempt to keep the African American in its place, which is a second class tier. And this was just another recent example of that fact. Going back to the film, as soon as Columbus landed on the islands, they called them others.
Yeah.
Other than what? Other than human? Other than us? So again, you're not part of us. You're not part of the civilized, of the godly, so to speak. And that's what they have used to decimate throughout the history until today even. And so that's why that term other is so dangerous, because I want you to remember, if you don't already know, there was a point in time where if a person who was 99% white had one drop of African blood in their system, they were considered Black. Okay, that's how this thing started. They were talking purity. And so now this is just another tool to keep people in their places.
Which I always think is interesting too, like when you said that where Hitler is concerned, even with the Jews, right? And Hitler was just as brown-headed, and I mean, far from what he was trying to,
Exactly.
call pure, and yet annihilated an entire, race of people as a result. Yeah. I'm sorry, Megan.
No, I mean, I feel like I just said it's really about power and control. And I also, I wrote down the quote, to those accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And so when you do have steps in the right direction, not that the Civil Rights Act was the end all be all, but it was a step, right? Then when you have other steps, for marriage equality or whatever that might be, those little steps toward equality for everyone feel like oppression for those that have been accustomed to that power and privilege. And I think that I really think that that's what it's all about. I mean, to code people as other or brutes or whatever that might be, it's all about maintaining that control for those that were already in power.
Mm-hmm.
And so then in any pushback, right, is seen as a threat to that power, right? Like you said, like you said, again, equality as oppression in that way.
Exactly.
Very interesting. Yeah. And so, and in thinking about that, I mean, he said, many telling things in this documentary, but I love he talks about favoring the collective over the individual, to look for the we and not the I. And for me, I think I see that sorely lacking in so many ways in our culture yet. But do you see any evidence of that being practiced in American world cultures?
I'm so glad you brought up the previous presidents. You know what? I see it, and I'm trying to see it clearly. And I know when he spoke about the we, he was talking about getting different perspectives from people different from him, and then synthesize it and then have a new vision forward. But the we that I took from this is the we from Obama's presidency and from Trump's presidency. And the we for me is that Obama even had slogan, "Yes, we can," and it became worldwide.
Mhm.
And I remember when Obama was running for president the first time, he was going all over the world. And I was thinking to myself, why is this man running for the presidency? And he's going all over the world, and people loved him. And he had this Yes, we can thing going worldwide. And it created the best kind of pressure for this country, which is called peer pressure. It created pressure for people to put this man in office. So Obama used the we worldwide, I felt. And then Mr. Trump used the we with the MAGA thing, make America great again. Whether you're on that side or not, it became a them, a we, a MAGA. To this day, he's still a powerful man and not even in office. So he used the we that way, but it's all perverted. You know, it's perverted. It's based on lies. And that's why I think in today's society, the I has become more important. And the way that I took that I is that I can go to a scholar of color. I could go to, back in the day, only scholars were white. We had this power structure that gave us the information for history that they wanted us to have. Now I can go to individual scholars who have different perspectives, and I can do it very easily with the internet. And that's the I part. You could get nuggets of truth that will sear through this brutish history that we have been given as a society.
Yeah, I think I just approached from a different perspective, but I think that in some ways the way that we're taught history is very individual. You're looking at it's almost looking at certain individuals and kind of putting them on pedestals and saying, look at what this individual can do. Even the historical idea of like rugged individualism where you do everything on your own. And so I think the pandemic has really shown us that that's what Americans are very focused on. And they say, well, it's what the founders wanted. It's the freedom that the founders wanted us to have. But I think when you actually look at the history of early America, that's not really what those people wanted. I mean, they have this idea of public virtue. And that was very important for them. And I looked up a couple articles about it, and I had a quote from, and if anybody wants the article, I can find it for them, but it said that, the founders didn't think that democracy would work if people didn't care about each other, right? If they were so focused on individual efforts and their individual gain, democracy would not work at all. But we don't teach our students that, right? We don't teach our students that those that started the country needed the country to have some sort of idea that we're all in this together, instead of individualizing it, right? And so I think that that's what people then are picking up on. And I think, I mean, yes, it's a health issue, but when you think about the pandemic, it's about, you hear people talk about, it's my freedom to not get vaccinated or not wear a mask. And it's like, I don't really care about what happens to you. And actually, historically, that's not how the founders, not my favorite term, right? But that's not how they envisioned America. And so I just think that's an interesting notion that we've completely left that aside somehow. And it's not getting taught in our history classes, right?
But can I extend it to ask you this question? You were saying that the founders of this country, per se, right, did not, they spoke more to a collective as opposed to an individualism. Yet they dismantled cultures that very much so practice a collective identity or a collectiveness, right? I think about the Native Americans in particular here, right, who were very much so, even to the point of, our tribe is here, our tribe, but still that connection they had, and they went about or even bringing slaves over from you know, Africa and dismantled these cultures that had a very much so a kind of collective notion or collective idea of community and sense of community and such. You know, how do you speak to that in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, just thinking about it historically, a lot of things have to do with private ownership of land. And it's a whole disconnect between Europeans and native cultures, you know, Europeans or Americans, you know, eventually, it's this whole disconnect. And it doesn't even, you know, it goes beyond the Civil War. Like it's not even, it's more recent history too, right? 1880s, they're still trying to get Native Americans to adopt private ownership of land. And I think that they just don't understand that communal kind of, you know, I don't know how to describe it. But the ideas that Native Americans had of, you know, holding the land in common. But for Americans and Europeans that came before them, it was about, I own this land, I can sell it, I can make profit on it. And so I think that's part of why you get the dismantling of native cultures, because they just have to have them adopt that, you know, that private ownership of land.
And even in that too, but even dismantling, I mean, just looking at the documentary and just thinking, and just from personal knowledge about Native American culture, certainly Black culture as well too, but even, you know, again, the more cultural aspects of it, language, right? You know, religion, you know, tradition, all those things were stripped, right? In the name, which is very much so part of a collective, a notion of collectivism, right? Or you know, kind of thinking in those spaces. And then, you know, like you said, again, all in the name of, like you said, not only with, like you said, with this notion of land, but also too, in this notion or idea of, you know, lording over, being the pinnacle, I'm the best, yours is not, kind of thing.
Right.
Mark, they were, the ultimate goal was to get rid of these people.
Yes.
So it really, I mean, even, so it was just like if they landed where they landed and they saw a pack of wolves, they could say, oh, those wolves have some sort of structure to them, but they're just animals. So I'm going to kill them and take over this land. They did not see, initially, they did not see Indians or Africans as people. They saw them as subhuman. And that's the impetus. That is an evil that no one has owned yet in the history of this country. So that is it. It's not even an arrogance. It's an awareness that it's almost like, I mean, I can't even put this thing into words, what I'm trying to say, because these people just disregarded life as a non-life. It's like
Peck beautifully embodies that in the reenactment when you see the kind of colonialists kind of look at the African guy walk past them, the ones with they had on the
right,
you know, and they looked at him automatically, reading him as less than.
Right.
Yeah.
Just like what goes on in schools and classrooms every day when certain kids are looked at by what they look like, and the expectation is put on them that is different from another kid that might look another way. So that's a present manifestation of this same psychology. You're just not going around killing kids right now, but you're killing them in a way. You're killing them mentally and psychologically,
socially,
when you don't teach them.
Yeah,
right.
I'm reminded of this is a little bit different, but reminded of a quote by Ernie Pyle during World War II, and that the idea that American soldiers looked at Japanese soldiers as less than human. And he said the way that people think about cockroaches or mice is the way that American soldiers looked at Japanese soldiers. And I think that's almost exactly what you're saying, is that and the way that I frame it to my students too is that this allows atrocities to happen, right? I mean, and there's some, you know, there's some things going on. And I mean, I don't want to get into World War II history, but it allows those atrocities to happen when you look at a human as a cockroach or a mouse, right, that needs extermination. Like that's exactly what Raoul Peck is talking about, and how you get to that point, I think. And so that was just, you just reminded me of that quote, and I think it kind of highlights that perfectly.
Yeah.
Pops, you mentioned President Obama here, and I admit to being, kind of remembering him saying this, and then hearing it again in the Peck documentary, and kind of being alarmed at what I thought to be, or read to be, a bit of, naivete on his part, right? In the documentary, it says that, it lets us hear him say, actually, former President Obama once said that America was not born a colonial power.
And you know where I got that?
Right.
You know what I thought right away?
What?
I thought that he is the epitome of a American education, because there are so many myths, there's so many omissions, and he could get a straight A in history his whole life, and if they didn't directly teach colonialism, it's over his head. And he ended up going to Harvard. Maybe didn't even take history at Harvard, or maybe 3 hours. So this man becomes president, and it is naive. It's ignorance, because we have purposely, as a country, made ourselves not the brutes of this history. And so at first I was a little teed off about it, but then I thought, and I'm gonna tell you where I went to. I remember my daughter was in 5th grade, and she was studying U.S. history, and she happened to mention Crispus Attucks to me. And then I said to her, and I looked at the book, and it never mentioned anything about Crispus Attucks being Black. And I said, Amani, did you know that Crispus Attucks was Black? Did your teacher bring that up? The first person to die for the liberty of this country was Black. Crispus. She says, no, teacher didn't bring that up. And I said, you know what? Your teacher probably doesn't even know. But what I want you to do is you go Google him so that she knows it's accurate, and that your dad said that he thought you needed to know this. So again, you could be the best product of a system, but if the system is only teaching you A instead of A, B, and C, you do come out ignorant to say stuff like that can be recorded, and you're the first Black president of this country that was founded on colonialism. So I just answered that question. I fall on Beck's side on that one.
Yeah, but you thought of it better than I did. I was like Barack, come on, bro. Like, I mean, immediately I was like, and I thought of it as like, who, what media interest, or what, who are you trying not to piss off, basically, is what I kind of read that as, because it was so egregious. Yeah. Right? I'm like, how can he not know that? Right.
I try to give him credit because I see him as human. Okay.
Okay, right. I mean, it's completely.
I saw him as a beast, an ignorant beast. I'd have been all pissed at him too. So,
but I was like, man, Megan, how did you read that comment?
Yeah, and actually, I just happened to see the chat, and one of our attendees kind of said it the right way. In American history, we tend to think of American empire as, okay, well, we have Puerto Rico and we have Guam, and that's our empire, that's our colonialism. So that didn't happen until 1880s, 1890s. And so because we think of manifest destiny instead, and so we think it's, we're taught that idea. I mean, I don't know how, I mean, I don't teach, I mean, I tell students what it's about, obviously, but that whole idea of manifest destiny was America's God's given right? It's their destiny to just take over all of this land, but
not kill everybody by doing it.
Right, exactly. So you think about the geographic history of the United States only being like, from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, and then somehow it grew, and as it grew, it displaced other people. And so, you know, I think I'm kind of late to the idea that America was a colonial power from the beginning. I think because that's just how we were taught, even in graduate school. It, you know, it was kind of like, well, some historians say this, but not all of them, you know. But when you really look at it and you look at the definition of colony, you have to say, of course, right? Of course, the United States from the beginning was a colonial power, because look how much it expanded and displaced other people in the process.
Yeah, and I think Peck, you know, in a roundabout fashion, is being critical of this lack of education that we've gotten, right? Or this particular kind of education that we've gotten, in this way that the documentary is kind of seeking to right some of these wrongs where this is concerned, and which is why, you know, him bringing up and I mean openly, you know, questioning Obama's, you know, take on this and say, no, I disagree with that, and here's why I disagree with it. And the evidence as to why he disagrees with it is overwhelming evidence. Overwhelming evidence.
Right.
Barack knows in private, you know, I don't know who he was talking to on that tape, but if he didn't know, Michelle told him later on that night.
I know, but it's like, that is not the truth. So I'd like to point to a particular one in the second part of the documentary, which I thought was, you know, not shocking to see, but it was certainly interesting to see things in reverse in this sense, right? So there was a review that I read of you know, in my research and preparing the questions and preparing for today. A review of the documentary kind of spoke to a scene in part 2 where we see a Black missionary from the Congo watching African overseers move these chains of white slaves, many of them children. He even said, "What are you doing with these children?" Right? Being, you know, whipped and beaten, and, you know, much as we are or should be aware of what happened in the African slave trade. And as we see them kind of move through the jungle, this reviewer, you know, described this scene as being wish fulfillment that provides catharsis to the oppressed and alternative timelines that serve as mirrors held up to tyrants. I don't know. I found that review a little problematic. This notion of wish fulfillment that provides catharsis, that me seeing oppression in reverse is going to make me feel bad, make me feel better about ancestrally what's happened, not only to my people, but what's happened to Native American people, what's happened to the Jews, what's happened to, that we're supposed to feel better when we see those things in reverse, that we feel better about that. How do you all read that review yourselves, or somebody kind of looking at us seeing these kinds of things as, oh, wow.
Go ahead, Megan.
This is better.
I was going to defer to you first.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Basically, I thought it was a bunch of bullshit. Because, and I say that because we've been able to read and study about the native peoples of Africa, the native Indians of this world, and the way they interacted with the world. It appears that from what we've been given is that the Indians were one with the land, one with nature, were content with their role, and it appears that the Africans were similar. Now, when there were wars and people became slaves for other tribes, those people were still looked upon as people. And in some instances, the so-called slaves of the defeated people could assimilate in the tribes, or in the different tribes on both sides of the continent. So it just occurs to me that the gods that the natives smoked for and the gods that the Africans looked towards was not a god of compartmentalization, meaning I'm better than you, I got this small group of land called Europe. I'm going to split it in sections, and we're going to get claustrophobic. And so then we're going to take over the brown folks of the Middle East, they money, because we're closer to God than they are. And then I don't see how, well, I take this back. I do see how it all occurred, because I felt, to a lesser degree, during Hitler's time, and then Hitler did kill, what, 9 million Jews. He was responsible for it. To a lesser degree, how President Trump riled up a certain contingency of this country, 74 million folks who believe in a world, in a country much different than I think, in terms of just how you treat people, presidential decorum, manners, being honest. Those virtues, people seem to have given up their party to follow this one entity. And as a people, Black and brown and red, I don't see that evil. I haven't seen it in reading history, and I don't, and I don't see it even currently, because again, remember I said I believe that most people still today believe in white supremacy, even non-white people, because we've been in the system so long, and I do not. I categorically deny that any man born white is superior to me just because he's white. So there is nothing in me that I can look at another human being, no matter what they are, to say they're a dog or a subhuman. And it was proven, and even as they were going around saying that, Mark, they disproved it, because they laid down with African women and had mixed kids coming out. So you can't perpetuate the species unless you're the exact same thing. So the whole thing is based on a lie. The whole, and the thing that's baffling to me about it is that it's lasted for 600 years, and it kind of continues to happen because people somewhere inside still believe in it.
And Peck speaks to what you were talking about, that these people that they see as less than, and they've had children by them, of all, I mean, they did it with every African, Native Americans,
Right.
Indian, they did it with every, it's interesting. Yeah, Megan, you have a comment about that, this notion of if we see oppression in reverse, that somehow those of us who have been oppressed go, oh, well, that,
I mean,
much better.
right, yeah, I mean, like, I think that, I think that we just have to ask ourselves, and I don't know that there's an answer to this question, but it's a question I'm just going to pose for us to think about, right? Is why does that scene seem so jarring to us? Why is that, right? I mean, I have my ideas of why that is, but I don't want to, like, influence others, but that's kind of the idea of, if we see that as so jarring, then why do we see that as so jarring? And that's what I think we have to think about, right?
Yeah, because I mean, looking at that, when I read that review, and I said, probably you said this, I said, I garnered no pleasure seeing a bunch of young white children being treated like the slaves of their, Black slaves of their age, during the slave trade were treated. I gained no pleasure from that. That provided me no catharsis whatsoever, right? Because again, like you say, in terms of how we think of people, but all of us as people, and like you said, to look at that and it's jarring. It's because history, I think, has shown us there have only been certain ones of us who have been in that position, right?
Right.
Everybody has not had the benefit of that type of brutality in terms of history.
I guess, like my thought process was, are we desensitized to that now? Like, I don't know the answer to that.
Have we evolved to a point where we realize that's wrong?
I mean, I hope so, right? But I mean, you know, we've seen photos of enslaved people, and we're used to those. I don't say we're used to them, but you know, that's what we see. So by seeing it in reverse, why is it jarring to us, right? All of it should be.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Seeing anybody in chains should be.
Yeah.
Right.
But that was my question, like why?
For no reason. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm.
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I see our time is kind of running down because we want to make room for questions for our audience. And again,
I want to throw something else at us while we're here.
Mm-hmm.
It's a scientific fact that humans came out of Africa. And it's also a scientific fact that the reason we have darker skin is because there's two different types of melanin, and you know, one gets dark with the ultraviolet rays and all that, which means we're really one people. And I think people of color realize we're one people, and for some reason or another, those folks that went up to Europe lost their mind with that religion and with that royalty stuff that Beck even points out. Yeah. And I think the fact that we realize we all are distant relatives, I don't think we have that in us, Mark. Look, here, I'm gonna show y'all. Can y'all see that? Y'all see that white girl? That's my daughter. That ain't no white girl. Married to a Nigerian. Blacks, as far as, again, the slave owners had sex and had kids, and they came out the way they came out, okay? We're all people, and it astonishes me that human cultures, human society for 600 years has not been able to acknowledge that. I don't get it. So hopefully one of you youngsters could help me out with this.
So we're still leaning into what Peck describes as what scientific racism, right? These experiments, right, that were being done, right, to try to figure out why these people are so different than the other person, and when in fact, like you said, Pops, we're all the same people.
So if I have a daughter that looks just like Jesse Rosenberg, how am I gonna hate Jesse because he looks just like my daughter?
Right.
You know,
true.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah. So you know, and again, these might seem like obvious questions, but I'm posing them for us to have this conversation, this dialogue about them. You know, why we still consider it so meaningful to silence historical events like the Haitian Revolution, as Peck talks about, and the slave trade, the Trail of Tears, or to even misrepresent historical events like the battle at the Alamo. Like, I mean, I have students that walk around thinking John Wayne has told them they won the Alamo, and I was like, nah, the Mexican cats got y'all, man. That's not how that happened. And when
because it is anti-white supremacy. For Haiti to have been so influential in not only the size of the United States, but in the fact that there was one group of people that resisted slavery and actually won a battle against a white nation. I mean, that goes against the narrative of white supremacy. I mean, you can't have that, Mark. You just can't have it. And there's another story. For kids who have extra time among your studies, there's an excellent biography on Bob Marley called Catch a Fire. And it gives you the history on the Maroons. Now, they touched on the Maroons and the Seminoles here in the States, but there were some Maroons who were in Jamaica who never became slaves, because not only did they kill the white folks who had them on the boat, when they tried to come and recapture the Maroons and brought some so-called Indian experts of the forest to capture them, those Indians were never seen again. So there's a group of islanders, which is why they're so proud, that were never slaves, that you don't never hear about. They called them Maroons from Cameroon. So that's against the narrative, Mark. You cannot have, it's like Hitler did not shake Jesse Owens' hand when he won those Olympic medals. You can't, if he would have shook his hand, that picture would have lasted forever. There is no picture because Hitler understands what symbols are, symbolic, what pictures are. He understands that most people are lazy, and God forbid, we have invented the TV and we do think John Wayne was a real cowboy and such. It's anything against the narrative. We can't have it. We won't have it.
You actually said something that I had been thinking about too, and that is, you know, we have a lot of national myths that our patriotism and American nationalism is sort of based on, right? And they are myths. And you think about the very first one of John Smith and Pocahontas, right? And this idea that this, you know, native girl fell in love with this, you know, white colonizer, you know, saw some good or some godly, and so saved his life and the lives of all of the other colonists to make the United States, right? It just continuously perpetuates.
Hell, what about Tarzan?
Yeah, which is in the documentary. Peck puts,
Yeah. And the Alamo too, which I, you know, when I teach it to my students here in Texas, I have to also recenter the idea that not only did they lose, obviously, but they were just whites that lost at the Alamo. Like, there were Tejanos there. There were ethnic Mexicans that were fighting alongside the you know, white Americans. And we don't talk about them. We don't talk about Juan Seguin, who was, you know, from San Antonio and raised his own regiment to fight against what he thought was tyranny. And
what about the slave Travis?
Yeah.
You know about the slave Travis?
Yeah, exactly. And so these are not, you know, I mean, yes, okay, there's a town named after Juan Seguin. I get that, but we don't know his story. You know, we don't know that he fought at the Battle of San Jacinto, you know, by Sam Houston, and ended up the mayor of San Antonio, but then got kicked out because he was other. He was not white, even though he had never lived anywhere else besides San Antonio. Like, he was a Texan, like, through and through. But because he was not ethnically white, he had to leave.
But remember, Texas was Mexico first.
Oh yeah, of course. So, you know, we don't, my students in my college students have no idea. They know about Texas history and they know about the Alamo. They have no idea about the other that was there, right? They and how important Tejanos were to Texas independence. Like, they don't learn about it. And it's just one of those myths, again, that just consistently sort of perpetuates the ideas of not only American nationalism, but that sort of white supremacy that becomes part of American nationalism.
I mean, I was actually taught in grade school that people thought the world was flat when Columbus came over. I was actually taught, and that's a lie. That's a lie. We've been knowing the world was a sphere since 300 BC at least. So, you know, a lot of myths. But I want to say to these young people, if we're running out of time, Mark, that a lot of the information, and I'm going to say, I was in college from age 18 to age 30, and I'm going to tell you that I have learned more about the truth about life in this country after formal schooling. So it's all about what you really want to, if you want to be a lifelong learner and study and really know why things are the way they are, don't trip, you know, get them grades, get them A's, whatever the information is, learn it, regurgitate it back.
Right.
But be a lifelong learner. Yeah, because I'm gonna tell you, as a Black man, I had to be intentional with my kids about making sure they were around people who were different from us. I had to intentionally do that. The churches that I chose, the schools that I chose for them, I was intentional about putting them around all different kind of people so that they would know that there are some Asians that ain't so smart. There's some white folks ain't so smart. There's some black folks ain't so smart and are smart, and some Asians that are smart and whites that are smart and Mexicans that are both. So we're all people. And the more you seek that, the more you will learn about that truth. And there's an old saying somewhere that says the truth shall set you free. We will not be a free country until we are taught our constituency the truth about ourselves.
Right.
Oh, Shereen, you had your hand up?
I do. I promised one of our participants who had to leave early that I would ask his question. So the question is, while critical race theory is generating substantial controversy, would you consider creating a critical migration theory, which documents how the various groups, Irish, Asians, Eastern Europeans, and Mexicans have been dealt with?
No, because there's enough written on it already. So no. Fact of the matter is, there's a saying that white supremacists like to say to black people about go back to Africa. Well, hell, we've been here longer than all of those groups because we were over on the first boat. Okay, and we are not immigrants. We are citizens. Black Americans are Americans. We're not Africans. And so there's enough been written about white history and all. And you mentioned the critical race theory. I purposely don't know what the hell critical race theory is, because if I'm talking about it, I don't want to know, because I don't want nobody saying I'm talking that, because I don't even know what the hell it is. I just know that it's taught in law school for the last 40 years. I do know that, but I've never been to law school. So,
you know, I think that to answer that question also too, I mean, I think, you know, when Peck talks about Howard Zinn in the documentary, and Zinn is asked, you know, did you ever think about including, you know, the history of indigenous people? And he was like, I don't know how to write that.
Good point.
Maybe you should write it. And she, I forget her name. Oh my God.
Right.
Yes, she ends up writing it. You know, unfortunately, he died before it, you know, and wasn't able to read it, you know, in its entirety. But yeah, I mean, I think that becomes the point, right? That, you know, we have Howard Zinn's, you know, people's history of America. Yeah, we have that. But we don't have the other books. I mean, I think that I think there are people like, you know, Ibram Kendi, who wrote Stamped from the Beginning, that kind of gets things. Yeah, you know, that are kind of talking about that. And, you know, which I always tell when, you know, particularly now, and, you know, when everybody is kind of like, oh, should I read it? I always dissuade people from reading White Fragility and tell them to read Stamped from the Beginning. I said, because that'll tell you what you need to know. You know, in terms, if you really want to understand historically what the hoopla is about. That's what the hoopla is about, basically.
He even talks about that white Jesus.
Yeah, he does.
That image, image of that white Jesus. This is very good. Very good book, y'all.
Yeah.
Stamped from the Beginning.
Yeah.
I'll show it to you here.
Oh, no, I'll show it to him right now.
No, here you go.
Oh,
no, you have one.
Got it.
Yeah. So yeah, but
I freaked him out when I called him my son, basically.
Oh, we just okay. Well, then I tell you what, since maybe y'all will come up with some, I have another question to ask. What do y'all think about Peck inserting himself in this narrative, which I thought was really interesting? The way that he kind of talked about, I love the way he talked about, you know, here he is, you know, kind of award-winning, talented filmmaker. His brother also works in media and was won an Emmy. He had a brother, he said, who served in the military and then suffered from PTSD longer than he served in the military. Right. You know, and then he kept up, but who am I? All of the, he says, I've loved in places, I've lived in places, I've done, but who am I? You know, here, you know, this Haitian man in these spaces, in these places. What did y'all think about him inserting himself in this narrative in the way that he did?
I thought, along with what you just said, I thought the fact that he had his voice as the narrator made it more authentic for me. My wife was listening to it, it kind of turned her off. But I was like, well, it turned off because it would take some effort to listen to someone who has a thick accent. So you got to really be into it. See, and a lot of people like watch TV, they want to zone out. So I thought it was authentic, because when we read books or when we think about anything, we hear our own voice.
Yes.
fact that we heard his voice and his accent, for me, just made it authentic and made it not mine. It made it his. And I'm trying to learn from him. So
Right.
it created a we moment for me as he spoke.
Oh, wow. Ah,
I think too that, even from the beginning, he's saying, this is about my journey of understanding, really. And, he's like, I'm not trying to write history here, but I'm trying to understand. And so, I think it was important too, because of where he's from, of being from Haiti and still having that sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Haiti was a colonized country at one point. Like it has those that history too, right? Even though they
won their
had the Haitian
independence.
Revolution. Yeah,
They were the only independent state. Yeah.
right. So I think that I think it was important, and it was also important to hear his voice too, right? To kind of go on that sort of journey of understanding with him. I thought it was good. Yeah.
What grade level do you think this should be introduced? I do think that every person who comes to this country to gain citizenship should go through some sort of class like this to,
definitely high school.
Is this a high school or even middle school or what?
I would say definitely high school, but I'm just bold enough to do it with 8th graders.
Yes, because people just don't know. You
Right.
can't change something if you don't know.
And I've had students, when I tell them the truth about Sacagawea, not Sacagawea, and they just look at me and say, why have I been lied to? And it's like heartbreaking to me, but that's sort of the reality. I don't know of any other discipline that sort of has to unlearn a bunch of things, but it's just like, it's hard, and it might be hard for 8th graders, but if you introduce it maybe that early, then by the time they get to a college class, they're a little bit more versed in sort of the realities.
I
Well,
want
as an educator and a psychologist, I just want to say I agree with all of you, but I think we can start in preschool as they start working on their Thanksgiving projects, and obviously not this, to this, age appropriate,
Right.
so that we're not feeding them lies for years, and then all of a sudden in 8th grade or in high school or in college, it's like tricked ya.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
It's kind of like the fact that people still think that the federal government led integration efforts in this country and we became an integrated country. That's bullshit. It was never integrated. It was desegregated, and that's forced. And as soon as it was determined that a entity was desegregated, it went back to its old ways. So the way that you, which is why I said earlier, I intentionally put myself and my family in positions around people who are different from them. I really encourage you all to do the same as you live your life. Try to really see the humanity in other types of people by getting to know them. And that's the only way color goes away. Because I'm not one of those people, and I can't stand people who say they don't see color, because that's not real.
Right, and no one's
Color
asking
is
you that
real.
either.
And we need to see it, and we need to love people for what and who they are, and not try to make something invisible and love something that's not real. So,
Patrice mentioned another book that's a very recent book that's also very telling too as well, and very helpful with this type of conversation, which is Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste, where she talks about caste system. She also wrote another book called The Warmth of Other Suns, which is about the migration of Black people from the South, not only to the to the northern areas, but also to the West, like in California and places like that. But yeah, this whole notion of a caste system in this country, it's so, it's not. all of this stuff is split in so many ways, right? And you know, and it's really kind of interesting to kind of think about it in these terms, and the way that Peck is even kind of speaking to that in this film as well.
Yeah, I remember how Martin Luther King said he was taken aback when they called him an untouchable, which was cast over there in that book. Yeah, it kind of freaked me out too, but it makes sense because the color is what differentiates us from all those other minority groups, so-called minority groups.
Another step, Mason makes a really good comment, and I think this is really interesting. If I can, I'm going to read his comment. Mason says, I think it's tough to accept and not turn a blind eye, meaning about the documentary, because as people, especially minority, we can't offer much to make a change in the world, it seems, right? My father always told me the phrase, it's a white man's world, and we're just living in it. And it's tough to have to teach myself a different worldview. And I think a lot of us of color get told that. You know, this is, you know, white folks, this is the white folks world, this is white men, you got it, you can't do what these white folks do, you can't.
That's what I meant by white supremacy, even non-whites having it,
We get told that a lot. You know, I think many of us of any color that's not white have gotten told that in some form, some shape, or whatever else. And it is tough to see.
Even you know, our parents in our day couched it as, you got to be 10 times better.
10 times better, twice as good, You know, so we got told that, right? And in this way, right, I think see people trying to work against that, but you know, it's very difficult. It's hard to do, for sure. Which brings me to, I guess, the final question I have, and then we can kind of, you know, close over here. But you know, Megan and Ms. Patterson, can these deeply entrenched attitudes, can they be fixed? Can they be reversed? And what will have to be sacrificed in order for that to happen?
Wow. Can they be reversed? The answer, behavior is changeable. So I guess the answer is yes. What will be sacrificed? You know what, Mark? I think the only way, man, talking about exterminating the brutes. Okay, I'm gonna tie it back to the title. I think the reality is the only way this thing is going to really be reversed is to exterminate the brutes, which basically means, I mean, we've been developing weapons of mass destruction for years. The world is in the position to be destroyed, and if we do something stupid and there's only a few of us left, then maybe if a few of us are left and we're of different persuasions, maybe then we'll work together. Other than that, a more practical way would be to make some of these behaviors illegal, because law does change behavior. I don't know, and behavior over time will change attitudes, but I don't know. I'm not confident.
You know, I mean, you know, my idea is always that if we educate people, and you know, so that we understand that we're all equal, then hopefully that will change. But the idea of critical race theory and the way that states are banning it, you know, whatever, it as a historian, it does unnerve me a little bit, because like there was a historian that put a whole thread on Twitter. We're a bunch of history nerds on Twitter. But, you know, and he's like, what if we don't teach anything about race in the United States? And it's just like, we can't talk about that. We can't talk about that. I mean, you're literally only talking about white men and white men doing things. Right. And if that's the case, then you perpetuate white supremacy. And then what happens when somebody that's not a white man becomes president? Then you get those people that are freaked out by, you know, and think that they're oppressed. And then you get things like Charlottesville and et cetera, because that's all that they've been taught, right? So the more that we interject, and even, you know, as Sharon said, let's start talking about it with the myth of Thanksgiving to preschoolers. Yeah, we don't have to go into detail, you know, we can still be age appropriate, but if you start by dismantling those myths, maybe
then the racists will come out in mass.
I mean, maybe, maybe, but the more you do it, I hope, hopefully I'm being a little optimistic. The more you do it, hopefully the better things get, right?
Well, I take the seatbelt. You know, everybody puts on a seatbelt now. And I remember when I was young in high school, we didn't have to put seatbelts on.
Mhm.
And when they started making us put seatbelts on, we didn't like it and we talk and something, blah, blah, blah. Well, now everybody puts a seatbelt on. So maybe if you change the laws against racist behavior, whatever that looks like,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
I'm done, y'all. I'm done.
I think, the way things are standing now and the way things are going now means that, the documentary, which is the topic of our discussion today, cannot be taught in a classroom. We were answering like, what grade should this be taught? Well, right now, this cannot be taught in terms of the way, and not only that, right? I think about the way where, because I posed the question, I have one written to ask, like, who exactly are the brutes, right? In this way and we know who the brutes are. We know what it is. It is white supremacists, or the brutes are the white supremacists. That's who they are, right? And these notions of white supremacy. And I even think about the way that we kind of walk on eggshells around certain things in this country, and the way that and we're not willing to have certain kinds of conversations because, we don't want to offend anybody, or we don't want to make anybody upset. But that really is where we are in a country where, in a culture, I should say, right now, where we're talking so much about moving things to the next level and which is certainly, I think, that is the goal of this film series. And certainly I think the goal of the work that Shireen does, right, is moving us to that next level, right? To get out of this cycle of trauma, this cycle of oppression, this cycle of kind of negative thought, right? And moving into these places of love and understanding and acceptance and tolerance and all of these, in these places. And if we're going to do that, I don't think we can be afraid to have conversations about these things. Fear is locking us down in so many ways to be able to talk about what Peck, I think, has done a beautiful job. Brutal nonetheless, hard to watch, like you said, Tobin, like, and others else here said, but it's like so many have said here, it's necessary. B, you said this, it's necessary. And as Toni Morrison says in Beloved, when Amy Denver helps Setha go, make it to Ohio, and she's massaging her feet, and they're hurting because she's walked on them so long, and she tells her anything dead coming back to life is gonna hurt.
Ooh.
So, and I think that's where we are. What's happening now, it's dead. And if we're going to bring it to life, it's going to be painful for us. But we need to live through this, right? Another quote, Alice Walker says, the way forward is with a broken heart. So.
Silence is golden, brother.
Oh, so thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you to our discussants, Megan, Mr. Patterson. Thank you so much. I think this has been wonderful.
It was fun, Megan.
Yeah, it was so much.
It's been so great. And thank you all so much for coming. Shireen, I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mark, for suggesting the film, for curating our film series, for your beautiful questions. Thank you, Mr. Patterson and Megan. Really appreciate your time and the fantastic, engaging discussion.
Great.
It's a pleasure meeting you, Sharon, and
nice.
Pops. Son, anytime.
Hi, Pops. See you. Bye. See you around.
All right.
I'll see y'all in class tomorrow.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Good night, everyone.
Bye, y'all.